I would say this, wouldn't I? Because I worked in the public sector for 30 years, but I think financial management is more difficult in the public sector than the private sector. And there are a number of reasons why I say that. There's often this thought that somehow public sector should adopt private sector practices because we're kind of alike, we employ people to do work and we should be efficient. But as Boyne said, that actually the public and private sectors are alike in unimportant ways. And when it comes to the important stuff, public sector financial performance is understood as a means to an end. So a public service uses money to make some services to deliver well-being to society. Private firms are driven by money. They use money to make more money. That's what private sector managers are all about. How can we make more money for our owners? Public services, on the other hand, are driven much more by politics, whether that's national or local. It's through politics that civil servants know what's important to society, and that drives what they produce. Financial management is also difficult because of how big governments are. I mean, yes, there are some very, very large companies in the world that are bigger than some countries, but generally, in most economies, the government will be the biggest player. So if I look at the government of Kenya in 2019, its budget, 2.9 trillion shillings, is 25% of GDP. So 1 in every 4 shillings spent in Kenya is spent by the government. In Uganda, it's roughly the same. If I look at my own country, we have a government budget of over 800 billion pounds, but it's 38%. So almost 4 in every 10 pounds spent in Britain is spent by the government. Then there's public expectations. So as Mother Teresa would put it, it's doing the impossible for the ungrateful. There's all kinds of things public servants are trying to produce, whether it's healthcare and education and so on. Yes, and sometimes people are grateful and sometimes they're not. Sometimes people are happy to pay taxes and oftentimes they're not. But it all makes managing public money more difficult. Accountability makes things difficult. If you don't want to be accountable, you shouldn't get a public job. But this whole idea of openness, transparency, accountability dates back several thousand years. So here's a quote from Aristotle talking about the need for public money to be spent openly so that everyone could see the accounts and so on. That makes things more difficult. And the last one of my reasons is not everything is for sale. In the private sector, as well as making goods for sale, that's what the private sector is about, we often see that companies bought wholesale because ultimately even a company is for sale. That's just not the case in the public sector. There are many, many things which the public sector buys or invests in for good. When a road is built, there's no thought that somehow that road will be sold in the future. The road is there to help people get from one place to another. And pretty much all government assets are actually bought for the delivery of services, not bought with the idea somehow of making a profit later. And we should remember that when we get to Module 2 and we start talking about international public sector accounting standards. That's it for this lecture. In the next lecture, we'll look at defining what public financial management is.